So 2 chapters this week. And for those listening, if you're only going to read 1 chapter of this book, chapter 12 is worth it because it's so funny and the absurdist humor just shines through brilliantly. So
And you don't need to know much about the plot, you can just jump right in.
right,
But
it's
that's a self-standing. It's a self-standing. I love that.
so we left off in the clinic, and Ivan Nikolaevich is in the clinic, and a stranger shows up and just pushes him, and that's where the chapter ends. So now we relocate to the Variety Theater in Moscow, where it's showtime. This is what Volin has been wanting to do since he got here, stage this black magic show. So the chapter opens up with this family doing this cycling act on stage, and it's pretty priceless. Like there's like the first person that comes out, he's like doing a wheelie, and then he unscrews the front wheel on his bike while he's doing a wheelie, and then flips upside down and is pedaling around on one wheel with his hands. And then there's my personal favorite. There's this 8-year-old kid in like this little 2-wheeler bike with a giant car horn rigged to the bike, which I thought was hilarious. So Bulgakov is just kind of showing his absurdist humor with this, and this is considered what the Moscow people were used to seeing at the time, because we'll see just how Voland is opening up the show with things people are familiar with, and then he's going to move into some of the more dangerous stuff as the show goes on. So then the announcer addresses the audience, and he reinforces the naturalist paradigm that the Moscow people are used to, and he's saying, yes, this show is called a black magic show, but it's not really going to be a black magic show. And then Koroviev comes out and says, well, he's just lying. And then, so they're not even denying that they're doing magic. It's just completely out in the open. And so then Volin comes out on the stage. He takes a seat in a chair, and he addresses the audience, and he calls Koroviev by his stage name, which is Fagot, and it is pronounced Fagot, by the way. I looked it up. And so then
Is that a word in another language?
I think it's some kind of maestro in Russian or something. I don't know. Don't quote me. I could be completely wrong.
I'm a little jarring.
Very much so.
Well, it's spelled how you.
Just like the other word with 2 T's on the end. So that apparently the A turn is sounded out like an E if there's 2 T's on the end of the word. I don't know if it's a Russian thing or what, but maybe we could ask somebody. But anyway, so Bolin starts commenting on the technology in the town and the people in the town and saying how this town has changed so much. And he's saying that as though he's been there before, because he probably has. Then Bolin then inquires if the people of Moscow have changed, like the technology, and he feels that the performance is becoming stale. So then he starts a card trick and to impress the crowd, and the trick is pretty funny because he takes a deck of cards and it says he throws it into the cat's mouth like a ribbon, and the cat's name is Behemoth, we know that now. And then once the cat eats the cards, Koroviev, who's kind of the main showman in this show, he points to someone in the orchestra and he says, you check your pockets. And then the man checks his pockets, and then there's a deck of cards in his pockets. And then everyone's amazed, but then some guy thinks he's clever and he says, well, he's in on the gang. And then Koroviev is like, okay, well, why don't you check your pockets? And then he checks his pockets, and then there's like this wrapped up bundle of money. I think 10,000 or 1,000 rubles. And then after the guy finds money in his pocket, that's kind of like a precursor to the next trick, in which case Koroviev, he takes a gun, he fires it into the air, and then all this money starts raining down from the ceiling of the theater. And then, of course, people naturally are trying to grab it, and they're trying to kill each other over it. And we can talk about the implications of that in the discussion. Now, Belgowski, who's the theater ceremony master, he keeps trying to mitigate the anarchy in the theater by offering rationalistic and naturalistic explanations, which, of course, aren't working. and he's almost hampering the show, and the showmen, the demons, get kind of annoyed with him. So Korobiev asks the crowd, they say, well, this guy's being kind of annoying, what should we do with him? And then somebody in the crowd says, rip his head off. And so Korobiev says, rip his head off. All right, Behemoth, go rip his head off. So then the cat jumps on him and then rips his head off. And then Korobiev, he holds up the head of this announcer guy, and he has a conversation with it, and then he looks to Wolin and says, what should we do? And Wolin says, oh, just put it back on. And of course they have to get the crowd to approve. They say, should we forgive him? And the crowd's like, well, yeah, we didn't think you were actually going to rip his head off, so put it back on. So they put the head back on, but the guy's completely deranged after that. He thinks he's still decapitated. So then after that, Korobiev then manifests a gigantic women's clothing outlet on stage, and a red-haired woman, the one we've seen before with the scar on her neck, she shows up and she starts singing out the brand names like Chanel and everything like that, some of which are still around today. And then all the women are then crazed by this, and they're all rushing up to try these clothes on, and she's helping them, get the right fitting for their clothing. And it should be noted that the latest fashion is from Paris at this time, and most Russian women would not have had access to this kind of clothing. So they're crazy about it. And then when the shop disappears, the crowd then yells out to Wolin to show how he did the trick, or at least this one individual, not the entire crowd, but one individual in the crowd keeps demanding an explanation, because why wouldn't you want to know how to do that? And then Korobiev answers him by exposing this man's affair that he had with an actress in the theater who just got a really good role. So in this man's attempt to expose their tricks, Korobiev then exposes him. And we could talk about that later as well. That's an interesting dynamic too. And so then with that, they close the show with a bang, and they leave the audience wanting more. And that's where the chapter ends. Chapter 13 begins, we're back in the clinic with Ivan Nikolaevich, and this chapter kind of takes on a different tone, because most of the characters in this book up until this point have been paragons. That is to say, they're an example of either a virtue or vice. In this book's case, mostly vice. But this chapter, we actually really get to sink into some characters and learn their stories and everything. So we're back in the clinic, and the mysterious stranger that was just shushing Ivan, he comes into his room because he has keys that he stole from the nurse. And this is the master. This is the protagonist. This is the title sake of the book. So he tells that he starts to get to know Ivan. They start off talking about what they are, who they are, what they do. And Ivan tells him that he's a writer. And the master actually, pretty early in the conversation, says, you should just quit being a writer. Which is kind of a jarring thing to say to somebody that you just met, but Ivan actually really gets it, because he knows that anything that gets published by the state is going to be inherently inauthentic, because it would not have gotten through all the bureaucracy and the critical peer review process if it was something real. And we are also informed in this chapter that Nicanor Ivanovich from chapter 9 has also been admitted to the psych ward. So the psych ward just keeps filling up. Now, the master asks Ivan to tell him more about the poem about Pontius Pilate that he wrote, and the two become very good friends and start bonding over this because of the guest's past work as well. So it is in this conversation that we learn that Bolin is actually Satan, and none of Ivan's story actually really surprises the master. So then the master then proceeds to tell Ivan why he's in the clinic as well, and it turns out that he also tried to publish writing on Pontius Pilate, and he got raked over the coals for it. He was accused of trying to publish an apologia for Christ, and he got censored for it. And I actually really appreciate how they use the word apologia in the book, because if you look at 1 Peter 3:15, when it says always be ready to give a reason for the hope you have within you, The Greek word for reason there is apologia, which would literally translate as defense. It's where our word apologetics comes from. So he basically got censored for trying to do apologetics. So after that, then the master gives his backstory about being a historian, and he also talks about how he won 100 grand via the Soviet state bond, which is basically the Soviet Union's equivalent of the lottery. So he won 100,000 rubles, and he invested that money into writing about Pontius Pilate. So he then proceeds to tell the story about how he met his one true love, as he calls her. And there's a whole story with like flowers and symbolism, all that stuff. But the gist of it is that he met this woman, and she strongly believed in how important it is that this book gets published. And they both share a passion for authentic art. Now, he further explains how he was getting smeared and blasted in the newspapers for attempting to publish the excerpt that did get published, and that the backlash was so intense that his mistress actually wanted to poison the critic who published the hit piece. And it also should be stated that this woman is basically Elena. This is Bulgakov's last wife. He's writing her into this story. Just how the master is also himself. He's writing himself into this story as well, or at least his experience with trying to get work published. So he was so discouraged that he gave the rest of his money to his mistress, and he burned the novel. And there's some interesting there's some interesting literary imagery with this scene about like how it was hard to burn the novel. It's like it didn't want to burn. It took a long time for the words to disappear until the pages turned completely black. So maybe that could be a discussion point as well. And this is exactly what Bulgakov did with this book. If you were here for the first class, then we went over that, how he actually burned this book. So this is very much a kind of an inception. So the master was tempted with suicide, specifically jumping in front of a tram, which is an interesting throwback to what happened to Berlioz, but he was too afraid to do so, and he ended up checking himself into the psych ward, and he's been reluctant to contact his mistress ever since, and that's where the chapter ends. So, I left out a lot of details, because I think that if any of these details stood out to anybody, we could talk about them. So we can start with chapter 12 with the absurd magic show. Was there anybody that just had any general thoughts about that? Because it's just so wild.
I think I just noticed the theme of temptation and accusation on the part of our devil gang.
Yes.
Keeps on going.
Yep, and also the theme of how the demons play on the 7 deadly sins, almost like their playbook. Before it was greed with Nicanor Ivanovich, with trying to barter with him and haggle with him and offering him like a ridiculous rent price. And then here they're playing on greed, like making money appear in people's pockets, and then also vanity for the women, like making a gigantic clothing outlet appear. I think that's a good observation.
Something else is they always titled it Black Magic and it's expose, but it wasn't really. It's like it was intended to be black magic and an expose, but not an expose of the black magic. It's an expose of the people.
Yes.
As they continuously call people out every time they try to do something.
Yeah, I think too, a note that I had written down here is one of the things that Bulgakov was attempting to indict the Soviet Union of was just the blatant hypocrisy of it, because it's supposed to eliminate greed and make everybody equal, but even earlier in that chapter, Volin says, well, men love money, whether it's made of leather or paper or bronze or gold. that never changes. And so he's using that to prey on these people.
And it's interesting too because the scene where it's raining money from the ceiling, basically there's just money raining everywhere and people are still deciding to fight with each other over the money that's falling.
Mm.
Like people are like grabbing it out of each other's hands like as if there's not enough already flying around the room. Like they have to take it from the person next to them as well. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I heard they did a survey once where they asked people, would you rather make more money, but it's the same amount as everyone else, or less money, but it's more than everyone else? Like they would rather make less money as long as it's everyone else. So it really is like, it is the competitive thing to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, it really is more so the status thing. That's what people. I mean, in a way, like, you know, I think that study does show, because I heard about that same study. I actually watched a documentary on the 7 deadly sins where they brought that up with the sin of greed. And they were basically just trying to say that, like, it's not even, like, people don't even care about having a lot of money. They just want more than everybody else. And I think, actually, I don't think it was greed. I think it was envy that they used that survey to I guess, prove their point on that.
That's true, and also later when it came to the clothing scene, everyone was reluctant at first, but as soon as the first woman went up and she got fitted and she came out and she looked good, then all of the other women like immediately stormed the stage. Like at first they were like, nah, we don't do that.
It was also like, I think in the Soviet Union, always danger of doing something that everyone else is not doing, because you never know what you could get in trouble for. So like there's safety in numbers, like one, I mean, and in general there's safety in numbers too, but safety in perfect.
Yeah, I think the way he wrote this is really interesting because it just escalates the more the show goes on. Like as it starts out, of course, it seems like just kind of like an absurd cycling show, and then the card trick was a little bit weird, but then it got even weirder, making the deck appear in other people's pockets. And then things get even weirder when money starts raining from the ceiling. And then I think the weirdness hits its apex when they rip the theater ceremony master's head off. And then Voland is almost like trying to gauge what the people are going to do, because people actually wanted them to put the head back on. It's almost like the book doesn't explicitly say this, but I can't help but imagine that maybe Voland was a little disappointed in that, because so much of this book has been him like poking and prodding the society to see what he can get away with.
It's also interesting he phrases it in that way. He phrases it as, should we forgive him?
Yeah. As opposed to
Not
should we
as in,
resuscitate him.
he didn't say should we put the head back on. He said should we forgive him?
Yeah.
Also I think you did mention this, but the utter powerlessness of like scientific materialism to stand up to the devil, like, you know, that was the philosophy that the Soviets put their flag on, was scientific materialism, and like that's going to eliminate evil, and it's just absolutely powerless because evil's real.
Yep.
Like I feel like this whole book is sort of meditation on like a seventh truth. Like, well, you don't know that God exists, but the devil definitely does. So therefore, maybe he does.
It's a little interesting because the section where they rip the guy's head off is in between the money part and the boutique. So that didn't deter anybody from leaving the show or anything.
Or getting on stage.
Yeah, and the guy at the very end, I forget his name, the one who's up in the like top section, the important guy, who voices like he's wanting to expose them, like he has no rational explanation for anything, and he still wants one. Like he's still lobbying for it.
Yeah. And something that I had for him as well, since you bring him up, is in a way he's almost like virtue signaling up there. He's saying like, no, you got to explain how you did this, because like who wouldn't want to know how to make money rain from the ceiling, you know? And almost like saying like you have an obligation to explain this to us. And and Koroviev said like, okay, well, I'll explain that to you if you explain to me where you were last night. And so by him attempting to expose their tricks, their secrets, he exposed him. So it's almost like a weird, twisted form of justice in a way. And we saw this same thing happen with Nicanor Ivanovich when they were trying to get Berlioz's apartment. When they were saying like, okay, well, how about you? Because like he plays on his greed, he exposes his greed, takes advantage of it, and then he ends up misfortune ends up befalling him because of it. So it's almost a twisted sense of justice, but it's not really like true justice. It's like a mock sense of justice, which coincides perfectly with what the church teaches about demonology, because like they can't really invent anything new. All they can take is the good things that God already has and just twist them.
Well, it's kind of like a bit of an inverse of the story of like Christ with the stoning of the adulterous woman, right? Where he says like, "And who's without sin, throw the first stone." And instead, we see like, "I'll try to hit you with the stone, and you try to hit me with the stone back." Right? It's like it's a much more simple kind of justice as opposed to like God's justice, which is so just it's unjust, right? Or according to Saint Isaac Syrian.
Yes, it's like well, if what we're taught about God's justice is putting everything in order. What are we seeing here? This is just anarchy. This is just chaos. And I do like how Bulgakov is making these demons agents of chaos. Because ever since the beginning of the book, they've been driving people clinically insane. I think in this next chapter we see 2 more characters that end up in the psych ward. Like there's 4 characters in the story that are in the psych ward. So everybody who comes in contact,
All in the same psych ward.
all in the same psych ward.
Well, it's also like they only have power over like bad people, right? It's like I don't know what would happen if they encountered a good person. I mean, maybe not exist, but
What's also interesting is all the ones who end up in psych ward are adults.
Yeah,
We don't have children.
right. That's a good observation. And just for the sake of, just to state the obvious, could you expand on that as to why that might be? See if we're thinking the same thing.
Well, it's just with age comes sin.
also say the children won't be broken by sin.
Yeah, and they won't be able to see this because we start off chapter 12 with a child starting off the gap. So the child's more in tune of the show.
Yeah.
Like,
Children are more likely to believe things. And, like I don't know any 5-year-old atheists. But yeah, I think it's a good thought. So, yeah, were there any more thoughts on the show?
It's interesting that we get like the ceremony master, like at one point he calls out like, mass hypnosis, like as an explanation for everything.
Yeah.
Like that's his rational answer. That mass hypnosis is like a reasonable thing that can just happen.
As if that's why money's falling from the ceiling.
Yeah. He's like, it's all an illusion. Like tomorrow, all that money's just gonna be gone, and
Yeah.
that's when they tell him. That's when they want to rip his head off.
Yeah.
As soon as he says all that stuff you got is fake and it's gonna disappear,
Yeah.
they immediately turn on him.
What's so insane too is how like the demons and the devil here, like they're not even trying to hide what they are really. They're just doing what they do because they know they're in a climate where they can get away with it.
yeah. Well, they get the audience so worked up that they can sneak out of the show because the police are only brought in at the end.
Yeah.
And
They get offended when people don't believe in them. From the very beginning, Voland he killed Berlioz because Berlioz was one of the ones that like didn't believe in him, and like they get offended when people don't believe in them. But they also like that's what gives them their power. Like they can walk through Moscow just fine because nobody's gonna believe in the devil in Moscow.
Yeah, that's very much a main theme here, and yeah, that's a theme that's been very consistent, especially up until these chapters. Is they can get away with anything they want because no one believes in them, but it's like they want, but it makes them so brazen to the point where they could just say, "Yeah, this is who we are. This is what we do. What are you gonna do about it? Nothing." Like it's like the ultimate power play in a way. They're just unstoppable. So, in the next chapter. This is kind of where we actually get some real character development, I think, for the first time in the book. Because, like I said in the opening, like everyone's been a paragon. Everyone's just been like, this is what a bad example looks like. You know, or they're there to illustrate a point. But this time we get introduced to the master. What is everyone's take on the master? Or just from this chapter? How do you feel about him?
Well, I actually this time.
Okay. Well, I will share. I think he is a good guy who is suffering from a little bit of cowardice. Yes. Okay, that is one of the themes in this book, is authenticity and cowardice. Because he doesn't want to contact his mistress because he's afraid of the repercussions of how he basically gave up. Like the very first thing he says is he says, "I don't want to escape from here because I got nowhere to escape to." He's completely thrown his.
She always.
That's true.
Is she the reacher? She was the one who came in the garden, like everything.
She also spoke to him first.
Yeah.
Because he was thinking about talking to her, but he didn't. And then she
Yeah.
talked to him.
And it was such a bizarre interaction because she's like, "Do you like my flowers?" And he's like, "No."
Because he's clearly supposed to be Bulgakov
Mm-hmm.
in the story, you know.
So
And
he's
the only way we know it's Bulgakov, it's like, I don't know, it's like he led a rough life.
Yeah. Well.
I mean, just the way he treated his first wife, and then also his second one.
Well, I think the second one is the one that really got the short end of the stick. I mean, I guess you could make
The
first.
Got
Because
the
she,
short end of the stick because she was with him through the worst stuff.
yeah, she was.
Through his depression, through his morphine addiction, post World War One, like,
Yes, very much so.
and she nursed him back to health and got him as healthy as she could, and then he like left her.
What's crazy is we see the same. Okay, I don't know if it's the same dynamic, but it is worth pointing out that towards the end of this, when he's burning his manuscript, that woman comes rushing in and she's like saying like, "You're sick. I'm gonna help heal you. Like you can't be like this. You're destroying yourself." Because like he said, like I'm having visions of like a giant squid coming through the window and like terrorizing me, because the critiques were stressing him out so much. And all she wanted for him was just for him to be well. And she regrets even trying to push him to publish his piece to begin with. So, I don't know if, like, initially when I read this, like, this woman's already married, by the way.
They're both already married.
Because
Yes.
that is another interesting thing. His wife encouraged the cowardice because she didn't want him to befriend anyone. She wanted the publication to stop, and she wanted him to flee. She was the one who recommended he go to the Black Sea, and it wasn't in the future, far distant future. It's no about this now.
Yeah.
Like actually, this is a just confusing sense of morality. It's like you're willing to die for like this section of morality, but like very blatantly involved in this other sense of morality. Yeah, again, it's just a reminder to like self-reflect on ways. What am I doing? You know,
Yes.
The other commandments.
all the time. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That dynamic between him and his mistress I found very interesting. There's also some flower imagery as well. The, her flowers are yellow, and he hates that color. And what's interesting is when he had that cap, when he showed that cap to Yvonne, it's like that cap had a yellow M color as her flowers, and also Boland, his ID card just had like a W in it. It's almost like Bulgakov is using that imagery to link these two characters because I mean I think we know, I'm not spoiling anything, these two are going to meet up. The Master and Boland are going to interact later.
Oh, something that stood out to me, is I think maybe because I'm not an artist, I feel like some people really romanticize this sort of very disheveled, like gross, down in the dirt kind of relationships where like they're both like in a lot of sin and drinking all the time and like living somewhere trashy and there's something like romantic about that. Like I mean, this is like a theme in like a lot of different books. It's like the outlaw couple or something, you know. It's like I don't just never seen the appeal. Like I think Bulgakov, like in his drug use and many wives, was probably somewhere in there.
I think you're right. Like I also agree with your point that I don't find that
It's like-
there, but
It's
but like it's what you're saying, right? Like, it's they're going to such a length because like even for them to meet up, they have to like plan everything and like they can't get caught by either one of their spouses. And like there's always all this stuff going on.
really love each other.
That's like I think that's supposed to be the underlying premise. Like they love each other so much that they're willing to go through all this stuff. But it's like they put themselves in the situation.
And there's also like the sense of like no standards, which I think maybe people enjoy, where it's like, yeah, we can be like drunken, cheating, disheveled people together, and like, you know, neither of us has to is judging the other one.
She also is the one who makes the commitment to leave her husband. Whereas he doesn't.
Well, that's exactly what
But she's not.
That was at the very end. She
He's so entranced by his cheating.
That she throws out that she's pregnant.
And as a historical parallel, Bulgakov's third wife was also married when they were meeting in secret. She was married to a very high-ranking military official, and yeah, he left him and her two boys to be with him.
What's also interesting is this whole, while this is underway, we don't get names.
Right. Bulgakov likes to do that. I noticed that. Like, we don't even...
Like, we don't get names. The
The master.
it's just the names and the woman. And same with like the stranger. He, the neighbor we befriends. It's very nameless, and it's all primarily after it. These two chapters.
And did anybody have any thoughts about how the master, like the reason he's calling himself that is because he completely renounced his old identity, his old name, his work, everything. He threw it all away. I think that's very. I mean, the thing with artists in the traditional sense is like I mean, these days, like the term artist has been very, very like cheapened. Like anybody can be an artist these days, you know. But classically, artists were like almost like a special like guild of people that could do things that most people couldn't, like write symphonies and put novels together, and it was different, and you almost have to have like a certain kind of psychology to be able to do that. Like, you know, when we say people are creative or whatever, it's kind of like, you know, everybody's creative to an extent, but like the creative people I know that are artists for a living, like they have to do that. If they don't do that, they just kind of wither away and they get caught in like a downward spiral into depression if they're not writing or drawing or creating music or whatever. And the thing that just stood out to me personally when looking at the devastating effects of the master getting his work censored is it actually seems in a way to be kind of realistic as to how an artist would react this way in that time period, because it's easy for, I guess most people to say like, well, okay, that didn't work out, so, whatever, pick yourself up and move on to the next thing. But it's like when these people, like, their whole life's work is to pour their heart and soul into something, and they're just getting suffocated by the state, they would end up in a psych ward. So it made perfect sense to me, even though so much of this book is kind of absurd and over the top and crazy. I don't think that this particular situation is over the top and crazy. People could disagree with me, but I would like to hear if someone does, like, what your thoughts would be on that. Like, you do this kind of stuff for a living. Like, if you somehow someone said you can't be an actress anymore, like, would that like kill you, or would you just move on?
Well, I mean, yeah. So it is true that the place that I want to get into most doesn't seem to want me. So, but it is also true what you said about there are, like, I have more of a chance to just like choose something else than maybe other people would. It definitely, I think just in general, when you have something that you've identified yourself by for a long time and that doesn't exist anymore, it can be a crisis for a lot of people. So, like an Olympian who's spent their whole life trying to get gold medals, they get the gold medals and then they retire. It's like, what do I do now? Yeah, I think it's an interesting opportunity to like, figure out what your identity actually is based on. It's something could be seemingly so a part of you, but it can go away for some reason. So what's left of you and when that's not what you do anymore or not who you are.
It's a complicated question because there are some people that would say, well, your identity should not be in what you do. Like, your identity should be deeper than that. But for artists, not that that doesn't apply, but it seems like for them it would be much harder. But granted, like, I guess the most artistic thing I do is just play guitar. And if somebody told me, well, I'm never going to play guitar again for the rest of my life, like, I wouldn't like that at all. But it definitely wouldn't kill me.
But isn't it different though when the state does it too?
Yeah.
And also when someone's your guitar is your hobby, you're not a professional guitarist. Like if you're a professional guitarist in the States, and so you're
your ears.
Yeah.
And if somebody were publicly crucifying me for trying to do it in a newspaper,
Yeah.
that could also have a different effect. But with it's a pretty great with Bulgakov.
Yeah.
With Bulgakov writing himself into this though, because like this isn't fiction. Like he actually did this, which that's probably what this chapter did for me the most. Actually, was a meditation on what an artist's art really means to them. Were there any other thoughts on that?
It's interesting to bring about not getting published that is the most crushing. Is it the anonymity? Is it the not having the chance to change his culture? I think that's interesting.
He did want to leave. He did want to move to Paris, Bulgakov, that is, but Stalin denied him. So, and he was feeling suffocated, and it is a very when things that are completely outside your control are preventing you from doing the things that you're trying to make a living doing. That is enough to definitely drive somebody insane, which is what we're seeing in the story here.
It's also just
Cheers.
it's interesting how the chapter ends because I'm basically asking him, do you regret not being published? And the visitor comments, I don't need to travel the world. The world's here.
That is an interesting thing to say.
And does that right at some points too. And it's sort of on that note where they were.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned sunrise because I was thinking of the yellow flowers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that speaks to the cowardice you were talking about. Like he has accepted the fact that his sliver of the world is this like little window he gets to look out of every day, and he's like okay with it. He's like, I'm fine with this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the state has completely demoralized and crushed him. So the other thing too, though, is I feel like we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the subject matter that these two guys were banned over, which is trying to publish works on Pontius Pilate and Christ. Now, we could all have reasons as to like, okay, well, they're atheists and they don't like that, and whatever. But like, I feel like that's just the surface. Like, why else do you think they might not like the idea of works about Pontius Pilate and Christ being published?
Were they banning all religious material?
Everything.
Okay.
You couldn't even do karate in the Soviet Union because it was too foreign.
Ha ha ha. That's one thing they share in common with some homeschool parents.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that they feared exposure to those things. If they thought it was ultimately powerless, couldn't they just say, "Well, go for it. It won't, it's powerless. We feared you." But they obviously thought there might be something in those things that would affect people.
Yeah, and that's something that Bulgakov realized, and he's actually trying to bring out in this work itself. Like, what is it about these concepts, these timeless concepts, that speak to the soul that the Soviet Union does not want anybody knowing about? And there's all kinds of levels of speculation, and I would absolutely. You could say, well, oh, it's because that if Christ is real and Christianity is true, then that means that everybody has intrinsic worth and that people should have freedom, and so the Union restricts that, and blah, blah, blah. But I mean, and that's a good critique, but I also think it's kind of surface level. I mean, specifically, there's a lot of emphasis on Pontius Pilate, arguably even more emphasis on Pontius Pilate than Christ. But why do we think that is?
Maybe because like being a little indirect about it makes it easier to talk about.
I think that's true. I mean, he does refer to Christ as Yeshua, because when you're using the historical name instead of Jesus Christ, then it seems more fitting for a novel. I guess you're less likely to get called out.
Pilate is very interesting place for exploring the story of Christ because he's the one who ordered Christ's death, but he's also fairly torn about it. He did not. He's generally seen in the gospel as being on Jesus' side. He says positive things about Christ, and he's also the world's first postmodernist. What is truth? He says, "I find no fault in the man. He washes his hands of Christ's blood."
It's always been about the Pharisees that.
Yeah, but he also finds himself constrained by society.
And also, and
That's it, right there. That's what I had in mind. He works for the state, and he, as far as we understand, he didn't really want to execute Christ, but he caved under the power of it, under his obligation, because he pleased. Right. It was a combination of wanting to please the state and also his own cowardice.
well, it's even just how John the Baptist saw.
It makes
Well, chapter 2 makes that abundantly clear that he didn't want to dish out that punishment. He even, was trying to urge them to pick the other guy to be executed because he was, like, easier to convict, basically. His case was more solid.
it makes Pilate kind of like a good icon of like your typical Soviet government worker. Maybe like he's constrained by his circumstances to do evil and like override his conscience.
I mean, the other parallel is like one of Bulgakov's criticisms of the literary community in his day is that they were cowards. They were not artists. They were propagandists, and they would do the state's work. They would publish what the state wanted them to publish, even if they themselves didn't want to. Like when the master is reading the critiques of his work on Pontius Pilate, he even says, like, I don't even think the people who wrote this meant what they were saying. I think, like, I sense fear coming through these critiques, you know. And then when we parallel that to Pontius Pilate, which is what his work is about, Pontius Pilate did what he did not want to do out of fear. And so I think a developing theme that we're seeing so far is authenticity in art, cowardice, and subjugation to the state.
Well, we see that too when the master first meets Ivan and he asks him what his occupation is and he says a poet. He immediately is like, well, then everything you write must be trash. Because in order to be a poet, you have to basically write trash.
Yeah, like they won't publish you if you don't.
So he just knows right out of the gate. Which I think also plays into why they don't know each other. Because like you were saying, writers at that time would have been kind of like a clique, like a guild. I think everybody kind of knows each other. You're in Mausolete or whatever, these organizations. Well, the master's not in those organizations. He's trying to do everything on his own because he wants to do it legitimately, but he's stifled.
And there's plenty of soft versions of this now, like whether in academia or the arts. Like, if you don't play into the main narrative of the popular culture, you are like snuffed out. Your blackball's really fast. So there's a reason that it's getting more and more snowballed in the direction of the certain, you know, the liberal left, whatever narrative, because the more variables get chopped really early in the process.
I mean, Disney.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's all been the same for the last 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing too, just to go off your point, one of the things that indicates the master's authenticity is when he won that $100,000. He didn't do what the other writers did with that money. We remember the dinner party earlier in the book. It's all all the money is just being blown on luxuries and hedonism and everything. Whereas the master, he takes that $100,000 and he invests it into writing this novel, and that gesture alone kind of separates him from the rest of the pack.
What a good guy, this master.
Okay, well, wuss, but still a good guy. But yeah, I think that is one of the disturbing things is we are seeing parallels today with like you said, if we, Disney's my favorite example to pick on because we see the same bad tropes, the same patterns, whether it's like an old classic hero getting subverted or if it's some kind of just overtly political statement overriding the story and the narrative to where the movie basically just becomes propaganda instead of like a good old school like Disney movie from the 90s or something. It's the same problem, and I honestly do see it as almost like a resurgence of some of the issues that the Soviet Union had. Like everybody knows the next Disney movie is going to be bad. The master tells Ivan, whatever gets published is going to be bad because we know who's doing it.
I saw Elemental, which is like really expected. And it is it's like right it was like, because like it used to be like, okay, here's a story, and then here's like the moral of it somewhere in there because there was a good story. And this was more like, here's what we want people to think, and then it's like, let's try to like throw story on top of that, or like hang little pieces of story on top of that, and yeah, it was like, it was lame. Yeah.
Is there any piece of literature or play published by the Soviet Union that we regard as good that was not eventually banned? I mean, the play that Bulgakov published, Turbans, was it the one about the White Army? That was a good play, evidently. Stalin went and saw it over a dozen times himself, but then they banned it because they thought it glorified the White Army too much. It was the opponents of the Bolsheviks. 10 years prior. Were there any closing thoughts? 7:39. We've gone 9 minutes over. I know, trash it, right? We're gonna get so.
We started about late.
We didn't start talking.
Well, I was thinking for our closing prayer, we will sing the Byzantine version of to the Theotokos, the Byzantine hymn to the Theotokos, because I know Jacob.
There's a lot of hymns to know.
That's-
But gotta be.
Okay. It is truly meet to call thee blessed. Because I know Jacob loves to sing, but I don't know the Antiochian one. Byzantine.
You're
I feel like that was a lie.
If you start it wrong, I'm in.
I feel like you know it. You've been coming to this.
Okay.
Okay, we'll do it 3 times too. So.
Okay, good.
all English.
All in English. Rejoice. I think that's.
But you're also doing the you're also doing the Serbian version.
George did this thing. He always does the same one after his my father's classes. Right, dude. What? That's mean.
Okay.